also saw actually on Facebook that you wanted to change the title of your novel.
Yeah, I think I've settled on one now. I got a lot of different input from different areas on all my platforms. The overwhelming thing that I got was all of these things sound like a Hallmark movie or like something romancy.
Reader is just going to be in for a big surprise when they start reading. They're like, doesn't feel very romancy.
Yeah, I finally settled on something using kind of the same words, but I reorganized things, and now it sounds the scientific fantasy that I want. So we're good.
Okay, okay. That's always nice when, everything falls into place. But though, in general, I don't get too attached to my titles because sometimes, like, publishers or editors or whomever want to change them. So I was just like, you know what? That is not a hill that I'm going to die on. My only thing is, I'm like, I don't care what my title is as long as you tell me what my title is, because I always have to have my title in my book. Like, someone always has to say the title.
That's an interesting way to do it.
But it's probably because I'm a songwriter as well. And so generally, when you write lyrics, the title of the song generally is like in your lyrics. So that's
Yeah.
probably also why I tend to do it.
That makes sense. I think for me on this one, it was just that the one word title never sat right with me. I never really liked it. And then I was reading something on the internet from an agent who said one word titles are hard to deal with because it doesn't tell me anything about your book. It's not terrible, you can have it, but think about being more inventive than just one word.
Fantastic. So today I have masala tea. I haven't drank tea in a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it's because I tend to drink like rooibos tea in the mornings. And so then at the end of the day, I'm kind of like over tea.
I mean, I feel that. It's late for you. Well, I'm doing a caramel hot chocolate.
I mean, anything with caramel is always lovely. So,
Mm,
I mean, you can't go wrong with that. Alrighty, are we ready for this episode?
we are so ready.
Hey ho, let's go. Welcome to Tea and Tales. We are so happy to have you here with us. I'm Marlene Einal.
And I'm Sarah Sampson. We especially want to thank Tanvir and Joy Peregrine for joining us each week. This week, we have an author spotlight with best-selling author Emiko Jean. And this month, she released her newest book, Love Me Tomorrow. Welcome to the podcast, Emiko Jean.
Welcome, Emiko. We are so happy to have you here on our podcast today because you have released a new young adult romance novel called Love Me Tomorrow. Though, side note, can I just say, when I went onto your website and I read new young adult romance duology, I was just like, this is not happening, because I was reading the novel and I was just like, if she's going to leave me on a cliffhanger, I am not going to be happy about this. I was just like, not cool, not cool. So I am happy to announce that I did not throw your book against the wall at the end, as it wasn't as cliffhangery as I thought it would be. So good job, good job.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a little cliffhanger, right? I wanted the doors open, right? That's what the novel ends on, an open door, and we'll step through it in the next book.
I love it. I love it. So tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I live in the Pacific Northwest with my family. I have twins. They're 8 years old right now, and it's such a fun age. I started writing later. I would say, now that I look back, I started writing when I was 33, which is not that old. But I didn't have the same career path as some who go and get the MFA and really start out knowing what they want to do when they're in college, and that's right. I was always a really prolific reader. My mom was a reading specialist, and we'd go to the library every weekend, and you could check out as many books as you could carry. So I very much remember how heavy my arms were when I would bring that stack of books out to the car. But when I was younger, I never read any books that were by Japanese American authors. I'm Japanese American. And I never read any books that had Japanese American characters in them. And so I think subconsciously when I was younger, that valve was turned off, that I could be a reader and I could love reading, but I could never work in that industry in that way because I just had never seen that representation. And so I grew up and I kept reading, went to college and I got a master's in teaching. And I thought that's what I was going to do because that's what my parents did. But I didn't love it as much. I think looking back now at the various jobs that I worked, which was like, I tried being a florist, I tried being a candle maker, I worked at a zoo for a long time. I was really searching for my purpose and what I would love to do. And I was working a job that I didn't love. And I vividly remember that I started writing a book. I would pretend to be typing emails, but I would really be typing into my email chapters to a story. And it ended up, I wrote like a whole book. It was like 80,000 words, and it was really, really terrible. So I shelved it. In that moment, I knew I could write a whole book. And I kind of proved to myself that I was capable of doing that. And so I came up with a different concept and I wrote with intention and purpose, and that ended up being Will Never Be Apart, which was my debut novel, which published in 2015 by Houghton Mifflin, which is not a publisher anymore. It just goes to show you how fast things kind of change in publishing. But yeah, they published my first two books.
I love how you came to it just by accident, because that's kind of how I came to it too. I wrote something for fun and somebody said that was good. I thought maybe I can do this. I wonder, because we have these rich histories behind us, does all of that experience as a florist and doing all your other things come into your books?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's interesting because I don't always see it on the forefront. So I don't always see it when I'm starting to draft a novel because you have these things that kind of pull at you, right? You have these ideas or these characters that pull at you, and you don't ever really understand why they're pulling at you. I think until you get to the very end and maybe even mini drafts later, and you're like, oh, I see where that came from. And so for In Love Me Tomorrow, one of the things that Emma grapples with is her parents' divorce. And my parents divorced when I was young. And I did actually see that one because it's kind of pretty obvious. I'm a big believer in like the journey and that it's all part of the journey. And so I don't have any regrets about taking this kind of like windy path to writing because I see where it's contributed to characters, stories, to all those emotional textures that you have in your writing. All of those experiences contribute to that.
I love that. I think I've always thought in my life that every year I want to get a different job so that I can use that for my writing. I was like, that's way too much effort. That's what Google is for. You have dipped your toes in so many genres. So this is a two-part question, including like thriller, and then you have your young adult romance, which you're doing now, or young adult, and book club fiction. First question, what drew you to these genres? And then second question, when you write, do you go like in a specific order? Like let's say now you do a young adult, then you do a thriller, then you do a book club fiction, or do you write whatever story comes to you first?
I think it's purely a reflection of what I enjoy reading. We're women, we contain multitudes. Well, at least I don't only read like romance. I read a very wide spectrum of fiction. And when you hear that kind of writing advice, like stay in your lane, you're kind of like, well, I have lots of lanes. I have lots of like, I'm a highway. So I think it's purely a reflection of what I read and what I enjoy, and also what I like grapple with in my own life. So like, for example, the book club fiction that I've written, which was Mika in Real Life, that dealt with parenthood and being Japanese American. And I had just had twins. Looking back, I see that connection there, that I was writing something that was very true to myself and that fit better in the kind of the adult market. In terms of how I kind of toggle between those things, it has ended up being a pattern. So I do kind of a light novel like romance, and then I do something a little bit darker like a thriller. And I find those kind of access different parts of my brain. So after I'm kind of done writing the dark thriller, I'm ready for something that's a little bit lighter, a little bit more uplifting. And so it's worked kind of well for me so far. I mean, knock on wood. I have though started to see myself being drawn a little bit more away from young adult projects and more into adults. So I never say never. The words go where they go, but I am kind of feeling more that I'll probably start writing more adult work on a regular basis.
That's really cool, because I feel like sometimes we think we have to be kind of stuck in a genre and you have to build that, and sometimes you do, or you do something similar. I wondered because we both have very different ideas of what book club fiction means.
Mhm.
To me, it feels more like books that can be in different genres that just seem to fit what people would want to read. And Madeline and I was like, it feels like it's a cross between women's fiction and maybe something psychological. In your experience, when somebody says, oh, this is a book club fiction book. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, so there's lots of different terms that I think have been trendy in the last 10 years. So there's like women's fiction, there's like chick lit fiction, there is upmarket fiction. And I really look at book club fiction as a cross section between commercial and literary writing. So it's something that has like a commercial hook. So a story that you can get right away and that sounds interesting. So for example, if you took like The Measure by Nikki Erlich, she has, like what if everybody got a string, the measure of their lives. And so that would be like the hook. That would be kind of the commercial part of it. But then underneath, it's such rich territory in terms of themes and characters. And so that's kind of how I look at book club fiction, is that it's a cross section between commercial and literary.
Okay, that makes much more sense than what I was thinking it was. I literally told Sarah, I was like, I feel it's any book that Oprah picks up. That's what book club fiction is.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't read it.
It also usually has universal themes, so things that are very easily accessible and, people can connect to right away. And so again, like with The Measure, it's something where it's like we're looking at our lives and what we do with our lives and what if you only had a limited amount of time. I mean, that feels so universal and a question that a lot of people ask themselves anyways.
That makes me feel a lot better. I feel like a lot of times we're querying agents or talking to people in the publishing industry, and just to understand what these terminologies mean to other people helps so much. And because you write in a lot of different genres, that has to take a lot of balancing act. Does your publisher or your agent come to you and ask, say, hey, do you have another thriller? Because we'd really like to build your thriller list. Or do you have another book club fiction? And do you switch to that? Or do they really let you just bring what you want to bring?
That's a great question, because that kind of touches on the business side of publishing and keeping yourself working and as a working writer. So those are discussions that I have mostly with my agent about the strategy and kind of looking toward what are the next 5 to 10 years look like in my career. I wanted to establish myself in the young adult market first, and that's what I've kind of been focusing on right now. But I also wanted to branch out into the adult market. So early on, my agent and I had a conversation about what that would look like, how many YA books I would probably need to write, what my, adult debut would look like, and then where I can go from there. So there has been some really strategic discussions on how to put those in the pipeline, and also just timing, like when to publish them, because we have a lot of conversations like, you have a young adult book coming out, you have a thriller that's going to come out, when are we going to publish those, because you don't want to saturate the market, and I need rest in between publishing books. And so it's really my agent that helps kind of help me define all of those things and kind of figure out what that looks like. I also am very lucky to work with Simon and Schuster, and all of my work is now under them. It's much easier to have all my work under the same publishing umbrella, because then all the editors can kind of talk to each other and also make sure that things are being set kind of 6 or 7 months apart. So my publisher works very closely together with the editors and everything like that to make sure that everything is kind of working cohesively.
Hashtag teamwork. I love that. Goodness
Hmm.
gracious. So, looking back at your career so far, what feels like the biggest turning point for you as a writer and why?
That's a hard question to answer, and I don't think it's any single one thing. There are a lot of milestones that have happened along the way. Obviously, getting your foot in the door, like getting an agent is such a big deal. Getting a publishing deal is such a big deal. And then it's ever changing after that, because I don't think I've ever had any publishing process that's the same. So the deals are always a little bit different. The editorial work is always a little bit different. The pipeline's always a little bit different. It's hard to say if there's even like one singular point that I feel like was the turning point. I like just to think that I have kind of these milestones that I've reached that are very memorable. Obviously, getting like book club picks is really tremendous. And, what happens with those is, I think as a writer, you long to write something that's going to connect with readers. I mean, that's kind of why you do it, is for that human connection part. When you get book club picks, you know that that's just going to be amplified, that your work is going to connect with more readers. That can be really fulfilling. On another side, I had Stephen King blurb one of my books, The Return of Ellie Black, which was amazing. Yeah. So I remember very early on reading, his book on writing. And I also read him when I was like a weird middle school and high schooler. I really found myself in Stephen King books because I felt like a big outsider. And so having him, read something that I wrote and then blurb it was probably like, it was the most exciting thing. I'm a writer without words, like with trying to describe that feeling when you get that blurb.
I feel like we all have our wish list as a writer of the
Yeah.
people we want to read our book and the things
Hmm.
we would like for it to do. And so to have that dream come true, be like, oh, look, it worked. It happened. Yes, I can't even say anything
Yeah.
either. That just sounds amazing.
Well, and that's all to say too, and I want other writers to know out there that there's a lot of no's along the way. So I spent a long time, like I remember, I was never told this. This is kind of behind the curtain, but when you write a book, a lot of writers have to solicit their own blurbs. So I remember very vividly with my first 4 or 5 books, I was writing letters to other authors and asking them to read my work and offer blurbs, and so many no's, like so many no's, and there was a lot. And it's hard not to take it personally because most of the time it's a timing thing where they don't have time to read and blurb a book, but other times it's that they don't connect with the work, they didn't like it. And so I was very fortunate with the Stephen King blurb is that I did write a book that I feel like was strong, but also, I had a publisher that was backing me and that wrote a letter to him on my behalf and was able to kind of get that to him. So it's not like something that I did on my own or accomplished on my own. So I just always want to be clear about that there's a lot of no's along the way and there's a lot of rejection. And sometimes you do really get, lucky and an opportunity to have your work put in front of someone, but that's sometimes not the case.
Absolutely. I told somebody just this last week in a writer group online who was getting frustrated because he'd had some no's from agents. I said, they're the correct no's headed to the right yes. Just keep pushing
Yeah.
forward. And
Yeah.
I feel like we have to remember that as writers, that everything is subjective and timing, and it doesn't mean you're terrible. It just means you're still looking for the right thing.
They're really false failures, I feel like, because there is no failing in publishing. There's rejection and there's no's, but there's no failing because if you've written something that can never be a failure, right? And that's just true, I feel like.
That is very beautifully said. And especially when you talk about your goals, because I think sometimes writers think they have to have these major big goals that they have to accomplish. And honestly, at the end of the day, if you finish the 1,000 words that you said you were going to write today, that's an accomplishment. I think as writers, yes, it's good to have those big milestones or those big goals and dreams that you want to achieve. But I think to keep yourself from not being discouraged, you also need those small little wins for yourself to keep yourself motivated and to keep on going. So, your books often explore love, identity, and emotional vulnerability. What themes do you find yourself returning to again and again? And why do you think they stick with you?
In the last 10 years, I have found myself returning again and again to the question of what it means to be Japanese American and what it means to be a yellow body in the world and how there are so different meanings to that. I have found myself returning to that again and again. I find myself returning towards generational relationships again and again. Mika, in real life, we had like an immigrant family, and so it was a mom and a daughter story, a mother-daughter story. And the return of Ellie Black, and my new book that's coming out, that's the follow-up to that, Before You Were Anne. There's a lot of intergenerational relationships. And then in Love Me Tomorrow, that's also true. We have Emma, who's our protagonist, and she lives with her mom, but she also lives with her grandfather. And that comes into play in a big way for her. Motherhood is something that I often touch on, not necessarily in Love Me Tomorrow too much, although there is a mother-daughter relationship that's at the forefront. Yeah, I think those are kind of the ones that have found myself kind of circling the most in the last few years. But that is also kind of ever changing as as I grow and find new things in my life too that I want to explore.
I think one of the fears that I have as a writer is that I might be returning to something too often. Are my readers going to
Mhm.
get bored if I am doing this theme all over again? Can I
Mhm.
put a new spin on this relationship, on this trope, whatever it is? Do you feel like readers are more interested when they get similar themes that they loved before with a slightly different perspective? Or do you ever get that feeling that maybe I've done this too much and I should move on?
I don't know, because I do think I always find a new angle to approach those themes. And sometimes it's lighter and sometimes it's heavier. People have a palette for different things. So maybe they want a generational story, but told in a lighter, more humorous way. Or maybe they want a generational story that's told in a darker, more specific way. When I sold my first book, this is a long story, but I promise it has the answer to it. Yeah. I spent most of my advance money, which was not very much, going to children and young adult authors conference. It's like a big one in the United States. And there are all these editors that come and writers and everything. And so I went to a bunch of panels and I went and I saw Justin Chanda, who's now at Simon and Schuster. He said, and I remember it really vividly, and this is many, many years ago. He said, publishers want something familiar done in a new way or something new done in a familiar way. And that's always stuck with me in terms of like how I shape my books. Like, is this something that feels familiar, but it's done in a new way? Or is this something that is new, but it's done in a familiar way? And it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but kind of sit with it a while and see if it sinks in.
That absolutely answers the question. And now you have
Yeah.
given me another quote for my quote wall to write
Yeah.
down and encourage myself.
That stayed with me at that conference. And I remember there was another quote that stayed with me, which was, you can't fix a blank page. And that's something that I've carried forth in my writing. On those days when the writing is hard and the words aren't coming, you just put what you can on paper and then you can fix it later. So, and that's also kind of what made me not believe in writer's block anymore either. So there you go.
So, staying on the theme of themes, but moving on
Yes.
to your newly released book, Love Me Tomorrow, how do you feel like that book fits in with the body of all of your work? And does it maybe stretch on the themes that you love, or is it something new?
Yeah, I think there's a stretch there where, it has themes about identity, right? So in the book, Emma gets love letters from the future. So it's someone claiming that they love you. But, she kind of has to figure out, who she is before she can trust love. So identity is, one of the first themes that she starts to grapple with and really wrestle with. In terms of like something new that I was playing with in the book, a new theme was more about like fate and timing. There's this kind of central question of, if someone from the future tells you they love you, is that fate, or does knowing the future change it? And so that was a new theme for me to develop and kind of wrestle with. And then this issue of timing, like, which is kind of everything in romance, right? It's like the right person at the wrong time, and the question of like whether you're ready for them or not.
Can I just say, when I read your novel, I was actually super impressed because I was like, this time travel was a little bit of a twist on it. Have I read many time travels? No. But the ones that I have read, I haven't had this twist on it before. So it was a fun read because it was a little bit different. And my goodness, the amount of times that I was like sitting with Emma and I'm like, girl, can you just not? Just forget about the letter, okay? And move on with your life.
I think that all lends itself to is that whole young adult experience, because if we look back at ourselves however many years ago and we think about our teenage selves, like there's so much we would do differently. And I think that's the lens now that we read young adult novels, where you're like, stop, you know, I can tell you from 20 years in the future that this isn't going to matter and this isn't what you should be focusing on. But when we think of ourselves in that moment and during that time when we're, 16, 17, 18, it's easy to understand why she made those choices, or she was a little bit more impulsive. And it also is easy to understand, given her background too, why she wanted that certainty, and don't we all kind of?
Very true. And I must say, I think young adult really humbles me back down to earth because when I read it, I'm
Mhm.
like, are you stupid? And then I'm like, Madeleine, calm down.
We're only wise now because of what we learned when we were stupid, you know?
Very true. So, what was kind of the first spark for you for Love Me Tomorrow? Was it like a character or a premise or like a feeling that you couldn't shake?
I usually start with a what if question. And for Love Me Tomorrow, I was like, what if you started getting love letters from the future? And then from that, it started to shape, well, what kind of girl would need this kind of journey? Like, what kind of girl would need love letters from the future? And so I began to focus in on Emma, someone who has seen love and seen love be lost. And so she went through her parents' divorce when she was younger, which was kind of a fairy tale romance for her. And so that was kind of her primal wound and what shattered her idea of forever love. And so, of course, these letters are going to come to her because she doesn't believe in love and that love can stick around. And it's going to upend this whole belief system that she has. And so that's kind of where the whole book started. And then I usually also think of where it's going to end. So where does my character start, and then what kind of journey are we going to take her on, and in that final chapter, where is she going to be at the end? And then I began to kind of fill in all those middle parts.
How are you going to challenge that character? I love how you framed it. What kind of character, what kind of girl needs this? Those are
Mhm.
brilliant things to ask yourself when you're developing a story. But we also see in your stories that you're really good at getting into that character's head and having that interiority so that we understand where they're coming from. We talked earlier in the season about having a deep POV, not head hopping, making sure that your reader is connected to the characters. And so, what is your process for getting into that character's head and understanding their motives instead of accidentally bringing in maybe your own thoughts into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Interiority is something that I've struggled with, and I don't feel like I really understood it until a few novels in. And so that was a lot of like when I was starting writing, a lot of what my line edits were about was like, tell me what the reader is thinking right now, because I had kind of thought it should be obvious. But when you're writing something, you have to make that really clear. I think from the beginning of my career, I was stronger in plot than I was in interiority. And so that's something that I've really worked at. And you really have to figure out the chain reaction. So Emma's starting here. She's going to receive a love letter. What does she think about that love letter? And what is that thought process going to drive her to do? So you have a thought and then you have an action. And that needs to be really clearly defined on the page. And it goes for any character, right? So thriller, romance, whatever. They have a thought, and how is that thought going to drive the action? And then there's an action that happens, then how does that action drive their thinking? And so you want to keep going in that whole circle until eventually your character gets out of it and has a new thought that leads to a different action. But it's something that I have to go back through, usually draft by draft, to make sure that that's really clear, that everything feels like it's being earned.
I think I am similar to you in the sense that when I write my novels, I have all these plot points that I have. And then as I
Mhm.
continue to write the novel, then all these, I almost want to say, connection scenes come in and they kind of fill in the story. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, my first draft always sucks because it's like a little skeleton. And then as soon as I get my beta readers to
Mhm.
come, they're like, yeah, it needs more meat. Then I get to the interiority part of it. So, speaking of
Yeah.
characters, and I feel I've said this like 1,000 times before, but I am not in control of my characters, okay? They have a mind of their own. So, were there any point while you were writing this novel that surprised you or that took you somewhere you didn't expect to go?
I mean, there have been surprising things in other books that I can remember really vividly. For Love Me Tomorrow, I had a really pretty solid outline for it. I'm not a pantser, I'm a plotzer. So I create very, very detailed outlines. So, in terms of Emma having a mind of her own and me not understanding where she's going some of the time, I didn't really have that. I did struggle a lot more with the notes and creating them more as like a plot engine for the book. And so I would say for this book, I struggled actually less with like the character development and more with kind of the plot engine mechanics of it, and trying to just figure out kind of how to build all of the mystery and the letter writer and all of her love interests and make sure that they were all contributing to the mystery part of the book. Because for Emma, I pretty much knew who she was and what she was all about from the beginning. I would say one of the things that surprised me more for Emma was the relationship that she had with her dad, because originally I thought it was going to be a touch more cynical and a touch more distant, and that was actually something that I felt like that was a more personal take on it, and that's not what the novel wanted or needed, and she needed to have a better relationship with her dad. Not saying that I have a terrible relationship, but I felt like that was more Emmy the writer and less Emma the character. And so Emma needed to have kind of a better relationship with her dad and a little bit more solid, because she has a tough life. I would say she has a tough life. Like, she cleans houses. She doesn't have, it's pretty insular. It's pretty closed off. And so just having a tough relationship with her dad felt like too much. It didn't feel balanced enough. So that was one of the things that I remember pulling back.
I feel like one of the themes you've talked about is as you've been writing and as you've been working through your career, you're learning all these new tricks, all these new tips that each novel is different and teaching you new things. I always tell new writers when they're frustrated, when they're at like their first book and they're trying to figure out if it's any good, I say, well, write your next one and see what you think,
Yeah.
because of that change that
Mhm.
comes. So, as you have been writing, are there new approaches to revision or to plotting that you do now that you wish you had done in earlier novels?
Yeah, I mean, my first book I wrote by the seat of my pants. So I was like, this sounds good for a scene, and this is what's going to happen next. And I remember my agent reading it and saying, like, all the DNA's here, but it's going to have to be like rearranged. And so I remember thinking of the whole book as like a crime scene, like that I had to kind of put back together. I think I probably did like 20 or 25 passes on that first book. I remember thinking to myself, well, if you're going to be a writer, you need to get serious about it, and you need to really develop your techniques. Over the last few years, I've learned to outline, but I've also learned to deviate from it. I'm not, so strict with my outlines, but I've also learned to think more deeply about character, which is not something that I always thought about. I've learned more how to structure novels. So, first act, second act, third act, and making sure that I really hone in on where my turns are in the book. Like, where's my midpoint? What's happening in my midpoint? Is this a saggy midpoint? What do I need to do to kind of bolster this? And so, in terms of technique, I feel like I've really focused more in on that the last few years and few books. But it's always, it's an evolving process. One of the best things that you can do is read other authors and see what they're doing. And it's anything from structure down to sentences. Like, so I don't ever think there's going to be a time when you've arrived, right? When you're like, this is it. I have novel writing in the bank, and it's always going to be evolving. You're always going to be learning new things, which is part of the wonder of writing, right? I mean, it's part of the joy of it, I think. Yeah.
100%. And I think if you are at a stage where you're like, I know everything, then maybe you should not be a writer anymore. Because I think, and it's the same with acting or singing, or I think any industry that you're in, like every day you can always learn more. That is what makes you a great writer, is if you
Mhm.
are excited to continue learning about the craft. Because even publishing changes year by year, and so does writing, so does trends, so does tropes. And so you also kind of need to keep up with all the things that are happening. And immediately when you were talking about how you thought about your acts better and your plot lines and stuff, I was like, did you read like Save the Cat? Because that immediately sounded like Save the Cat.
Yeah, I mean, I've read, you read all those books. You read like On Writing and Save the Cat and Bird by Bird. I do like Save the Cat as a roadmap. It helps me get started plot wise. And so kind of you can plug and play, but there's much more manipulation that you have to do beyond that. Yeah, but I was also going to say, to the point of like continuing to challenge yourself, I was going to say two things. I always feel like the next book I'm writing is better than the last. And oftentimes, too, I will feel like I wish that I hadn't published that first book, because I feel like I wish this could have been my debut. But, you're building a body of work, and that's what it's all about, too. And the second thing I was going to say, speaking of challenges, Before You Were Anne is my next thriller that's coming out. And I decided to write in second person for the first time. I was very inspired by it, and I was kind of like, I really like this, and I feel like the voice is really coming through in second person, and I felt deeply connected to it. But then there's also moments where you're like, I don't know, so it might not be great. But that's what I mean by kind of challenging and trying new techniques and things like that. And so I have a whole, next book that's coming out with the POV that I've never written in.
Second person is so difficult, not just to
Yeah.
write in, but to make sure that the reader stays engaged in second person. That
Yes.
I want to read it just for that.
Yeah, yeah, it's tricky. I've read books in second person, and there's not very many. There's a lot of short stories in second person, lots of poems, things like that. But to have a sustained narrative over time is tricky, and it is broken up by other POVs. I have two third person POVs in this one. So it is broken up. So I think that helps the reader kind of take a breath. And that was also something that I looked at while drafting the novel, is like, what's the cadence of this, and when are the inhales and the exhales, and when are we giving the reader a break from the second person POV? In terms of the book, it was the first POV that I wrote. How I heard the voice of the character was in the second person. So it was the first strand of the braid.
That's incredible. I have a question about writing your young adult versus your older, because you're
Mhm.
talking about the different POVs, you're talking about the different themes. I always wonder as an adult writer, like, how could I get my stuff into the young adult or a crossover young adult to adult? When you're writing your adult novels versus your young adult novels, what sort of things do you find yourself changing in your writing to match the age group?
The way that I view writing adult novels is a lot of my adults are adults that are grappling with the past. So they're unpacking how they were formed. And in young adults, they don't have that. So right now, when I'm writing young adult, they're experiencing what's eventually going to become their past, which is kind of tricky to think about. For me, when I approach young adult novels, it's mostly about and this is just as me as an author, is it's mostly about kind of unpacking the past, and young adult is more, it's more in the present, it's more right this moment.
Huh, that is, I'm so glad I don't write young adult. Like, that sounds like a lot of math. Not my forte, but that is such an interesting way to look at that. This novel, going back to Love Me Tomorrow, it touches on love and timing and personal growth. What conversations do you hope it sparks among especially young readers after they read it?
There's the conversation around divorce and love, and if love can stay and love can last. I hope that's a discussion that readers might have, or just a concept that they feel connected to. I also hope it just, sparks discussions about taking risks and the value in that, because it is hard to do that. I think when you're a young person, especially a young person that's prone to some anxiety, like I was. And so I would hope readers would want to discuss that. But more than anything, I just hope that they enjoy the read and enjoy the write. We talk about kind of the more serious themes, but it really is a lighthearted book. It doesn't take itself too seriously. You do get some deeper things, but for the most part, it's funny, it's fun. Emma goes on a whole journey, and I think in the end, it's a hopeful journey too.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Emiko. We really, really enjoyed your perspective and all the advice that you gave us today. If we have listeners who are trying to find your novels or trying to learn more about you, where can they go?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. It's Emiko Jean Books, and then I have a website. I think it's emikojean.com. But yeah, I'm out there, and you guys can connect with me either on Instagram or through my website. I keep both of those pretty updated on future works.
Awesome. And we will put all of the links in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We like to keep things short here on Tea and Tales. Get your fingers back on the keyboard and your pens back on paper.
And if you like what we are doing here, if you love the amazing guests that we have on and the topics that we are discussing, go follow us on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at Tea and Tales Podcast, and on Twitter/X and TikTok at Podcast Tea Tales. Then, to help us in the algorithm to go up so that all the people in the lovely world can listen to us and can join this community that we are creating, go to that purple icon on your device, go to Spotify, and go comment and like and share and everything that you can possibly do, go do it, because it will really help us go up, up, up. It's a moment.
And join us next week when we get to speak with language pathologist Kristen Nesser. And if you are a children's, young adult, or middle grade author and you would love to have a professional eye on your blurb, get on our social medias and find out how you can get into the drawing for a free blurb review with Jessie Cuniff. Happy writing.
Bye.